On December 24, 1971, LANSA Flight 508 departed Lima bound for Pucallpa and disintegrated at 10,000 feet over the Peruvian Amazon after a direct lightning strike. Of the 92 people aboard, 91 died on impact or shortly after, but one seat row separated from the fuselage and spiraled downward through 2 miles of open sky, landing in the jungle canopy below. 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke regained consciousness alone, injured and surrounded by dense Amazonian rainforest, with no radio, no map, and no rescuers within reach. For 11 days, she followed a creek downstream through one of the most biodiverse and dangerous ecosystems on Earth, while search aircraft flew directly overhead and ground teams scoured the wrong coordinates. The burned boarding pass recovered from the crash site months later became the document that forced investigators to confront a question they had never formally asked. Why did the search protocol assume there were no survivors? 92 passengers, 1 boarding pass. The girl who walked out of the jungle alone. The piece of paper measures roughly 4 inches by 7. Along its top edge, a printed logo, the red letters, LANSA, has been almost entirely consumed by heat, leaving only the bottom curve of the final A visible against the cream-colored stock. The left side of the document is burned away completely, but on the right side, where the paper apparently folded back against itself in the fire, a strip of legible text remains. Seat assignment, 19F. Destination, Pucallpa. Departure, Lima. Date, December 24th, 1971. The boarding pass was recovered from the primary debris field in early January 1972 by a Peruvian Air Force salvage team working through the wreckage of what remained of LANSA Flight 508. It was cataloged, placed in a cardboard box with 847 other recovered personal effects, and filed at the Air Force Records Office in Lima, where it remained unsorted for 22 years. When investigators finally matched it to a passenger manifest in 1994, something didn't add up. Seat 19F had belonged to a German-Peruvian girl named Juliane Koepcke. But Juliane Koepcke's name did not appear on any casualty list. It appeared on a rescue report filed 11 days after the crash by a team of lumber workers operating a remote camp on the Pachatilla River. She had walked out of the Amazon herself. She had not been found. She had arrived. The boarding pass, in other words, was not evidence of a death. It was evidence of a survival that the official search operation had decided, before it even began, was impossible. Lima's Jorge Chavez International Airport on the morning of December 24th, 1971, was running 45 minutes behind schedule. Christmas Eve traffic had compressed departing flights into overlapping windows, and the LANSA ground crew was working quickly to board passengers for the midday Pucallpa run. LANSA, Líneas Aéreas Nacionales, Sociedad Anónima, was a Peruvian regional carrier with a complicated reputation. In the 3 years between 1968 and 1971, the airline had lost 2 aircraft to crashes that killed a combined 155 people. Peruvian aviation authorities had suspended the carrier's operating license twice. The second suspension had been lifted only months before December's flight. None of this information was posted at the gate. None of it was offered to passengers standing in line. The aircraft assigned to Flight 508 was a Lockheed L-188A Electra, a 4-engine turboprop built in 1958 and known for a distinctive, high-pitched engine whine that experienced travelers found either reassuring or slightly alarming, depending on their familiarity with propeller-driven aircraft. Juliane Koepcke was 17 years old. She had grown up primarily in the Peruvian Amazon, where her parents, both German-born zoologists, had spent the better part of a decade conducting field research at a remote biological station called Panguana, located in the Pachitea River Basin. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, was a respected ornithologist. Her mother, Maria Koepcke, had published papers on Peruvian avifauna that were cited by researchers across South America and Western Europe. Juliane had grown up learning to identify bird calls in the forest dark. She had learned which creek water was safe to drink, which insects meant you were near a trail, and which direction a river would eventually flow toward human settlement. She had not learned these things from a manual. She had learned them the way children learn things in the field, by watching, by asking, and by making small mistakes in conditions where small mistakes did not kill you. Her parents had not set out to train a survivor. They had simply raised their daughter in a place where paying attention to the environment was as normal as looking both ways before crossing a street. She was traveling with her mother on December 24th because the family had planned to spend Christmas together at the research station. Juliane had just completed her final secondary school examinations in Lima. Her father had already made the journey by boat, as he often did. Mother and daughter had chosen to fly. Their seats, 19E and 19F, placed them roughly 2/3 back in the cabin, near the trailing edge of the wing. The Electra lifted off from Lima at approximately 11 a.m., banked east over the coastal desert, and began climbing toward the Andes. The storm system over the Peruvian Andes that morning has since been described by meteorologists as a convergence event, a collision of humid Amazonian air pushing westward against the drier, colder air mass descending from the mountain spine. The resulting cumulonimbus clouds were visible from the ground at Lima as a gray-white wall rising to approximately 60,000 feet, significantly above the operational ceiling of any commercial aircraft. The Peruvian Air Force had issued a Class 3 weather advisory for the Huánuco corridor that morning at 9:47 a.m., roughly 70 minutes before Flight 508 departed. Whether this advisory reached the LANSA Operations Center and whether it was reviewed by the flight crew before takeoff would become the central question of the accident investigation conducted 18 months later. The final report, published in August 1973, concluded that the crew had likely received the advisory. It stopped short of determining why the flight departed anyway. The passengers aboard Flight 508 numbered 92 in total, 86 in the cabin and a crew of 6. Among them were families traveling for the holiday, a group of students returning to Pucallpa, and at least one foreign researcher. Several passengers, according to later testimony from airport staff, had expressed concern about the storm and asked LANSA ground personnel whether the departure would proceed. They were told the weather was within acceptable parameters. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was the kind of answer that is technically defensible until the moment it isn't. Juliane later described the final minutes of the flight in interviews given over the following decades. The turbulence began approximately 25 minutes after departure, as the Electra entered the cloud system east of the Andes. She described the aircraft pitching and dropping, bags falling from overhead compartments, and other passengers praying loudly. Then, at approximately 12 p.m., she described seeing a flash of white light outside the cabin window. A flash that she initially interpreted as lightning reflected off the wing's surface. It was not a reflection. Multiple witness accounts from villages on the ground below later confirmed that the aircraft had been struck directly. The fuel in the right wing ignited. The structural stress of the strike, combined with the pre-existing turbulence load, was sufficient to exceed the airframe's design tolerances at that altitude. The fuselage broke apart at cruising altitude of approximately 10,000 feet, roughly 2 miles above the jungle canopy below. Juliane Koepcke fell from a braking aircraft. She was still strapped into seat row 19. She was conscious for the first few seconds. Then she was not. The debris field created by the disintegration of Flight 508 stretched across approximately 10 square miles of dense Amazonian jungle north of the city of Torna Vista. The heaviest sections of the fuselage, the forward cabin, the cockpit assembly, the landing gear housing, struck the canopy first and fell vertically through the upper and middle layers before coming to rest on the ground. Smaller pieces, including portions of the interior paneling, seat sections, passenger luggage, and personal items, were carried further by wind shear before descending through gaps in the canopy at less violent angles. The jungle canopy at that location averaged 120 to 140 feet in height. An interlocking ceiling of Cecropia, Brazil nut, and strangler fig that functioned in aggregate as an imperfect but not negligible cushion for objects falling from a great height. Objects with large surface area relative to their mass, seat rows for instance, decelerated significantly during canopy penetration. The physics were brutal but not universally lethal. Juliane regained consciousness on the jungle floor at an unknown time. She estimated later that it was still daylight, which placed her awakening no later than 6 p.m. local time. She had been unconscious for an indeterminate number of hours. She was still strapped to her seat, which had come to rest at an angle against the root buttress of a large Cecropia. She had a broken collarbone. She had a deep laceration above her left eye. Her right eye had swollen nearly shut. She had lost one of her sandals. She was wearing a short, sleeveless dress, the clothing she had put on that morning in Lima for what was supposed to be a 2-hour flight to spend Christmas with her father. She could not hear any other voices. She could not hear any other movement. She could hear the jungle, water running somewhere to her left, insects, a distant bird call. She recognized immediately as belonging to a species common to the lower Pachitea Basin. That recognition, she would say many years later in a documentary interview, was the first thing that kept her from panicking. She knew where she was. Not precisely, not within miles, but categorically. She knew what kind of place this was, and she knew it was a place she had been trained, without ever being formally trained to read. She called out for her mother. 17 times, she later counted. No answer came. The Peruvian Air Force launched its initial search operation on the morning of December 25th, 1971, Christmas Day. 3 aircraft were assigned to survey the Huánuco corridor and the Andes approaches east of Lima. 6 ground teams were dispatched toward Torna Vista based on radar data from Lima Center that placed the final transponder signal approximately 30 miles northwest of the town. The search grid was sensible. The coordination was reasonable. by the standards of 1971 Peruvian emergency response. The problem was a fundamental assumption built into the search protocol from the first hour. The crash was at high altitude, the aircraft had broken apart in flight, and no commercial aircraft accident of that type had produced survivors in South America in more than a decade. The search teams were looking for human remains and aircraft components. They were not looking for survivors. The search forms used by the Air Force at that time had a checkbox for survivors located and a checkbox for no survivors. By the end of December 25th, before any ground team had reached the primary debris field, the operational status of Flight 508 had been quietly classified under the second box. This was not malice. It was probability. 91 of the 92 people aboard Flight 508 were in fact dead. The other passenger, seat 19F, was walking along a creek bed approximately 14 miles from the nearest marked trail, pulling maggots out of a wound on her arm with a stick and calculating the direction of water flow. Her father had taught her one rule above all others for jungle navigation: follow water downhill. Every creek becomes a stream. Every stream becomes a river. Every river in the Amazon basin eventually reaches a settlement, a logging camp, or a boat landing. The rule was not sophisticated. It required no compass, no map, no prior knowledge of the specific terrain. It required only patience and the willingness to keep moving. Juliane applied the rule on the morning of December 26th, her second full day in the jungle, and did not stop applying it for the next 9 days. The first 2 days produced almost nothing. The creek she was following moved slowly through undergrowth so dense she was frequently forced to wade directly through the water rather than walk its banks. She found a bag of hard candy in the wreckage on the first morning, the only food she would consume for the duration of her journey. She found a small bottle of what appeared to be rum, which she did not drink. She found a child's Christmas present, still wrapped, which she did not open. She did not find her mother. She kept moving. On December 27th, she heard aircraft. Not one, multiple passes, at least 3 distinct engine sounds over the course of the afternoon. She attempted to signal by waving the white fabric of a torn seat cover into the small gaps in the canopy. The canopy was 130 feet above her. The gaps were 4 to 8 feet across. The aircraft were moving at search speed, which meant they were flying low and slow. But low and slow in Amazon search terms still meant roughly 200 feet above the treetops. No crew member reported any visual contact. The seat cover disappeared back into the green. She tried again the following morning, December 28th, using a piece of orange fabric she had found knotted around a piece of luggage. Orange, she knew, was more visible against green jungle background than white. She waved it for 40 minutes during what sounded like a sustained aircraft pass directly overhead. The engines faded north. Nothing changed. She kept moving. The physical condition of the jungle Juliane was moving through was not the sanitized wilderness of a nature documentary. The rainy season had begun. The creek was rising. The banks were soft red clay that dissolved under her feet and sucked at her sandaled steps with a resistance that made every mile feel like 3. The temperature at ground level under the full canopy averaged 88 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours and dropped to roughly 72 at night. Humid, close, and heavy, with the smell of decomposing vegetation and standing water. She was wearing a short dress and one sandal. She found the second sandal on day 3, tangled in a root system 50 meters from where she had slept, which she later described as the single most significant material improvement in her situation across the entire 11-day period. The wound above her eye had become infected by day 4. She could feel the swelling extending into her cheekbone. She soaked cloth strips in creek water and pressed them against the wound, which accomplished approximately nothing medically, but kept her hands occupied and her mind anchored in action rather than panic. The more serious injury was in her right arm, where the impact had opened a cut deep enough to expose the underlying tissue. By the 5th day, December 30th, she noticed movement in the wound. Fly larvae, working inward. She had seen her parents treat similar wounds on field animals. She knew the maggots were dangerous if left to burrow. She pulled them out with a narrow stick, one by one over the course of an afternoon, counting to stay calm. She removed 35 larvae from that wound alone. She kept moving. She had been rationing the hard candy since the first morning. By day 6, she had 12 pieces remaining. She divided them into portions, 2 per day for the remaining 6 days she calculated she might need before reaching a settlement, based on the pace of the creek's widening. The creek had been narrowing on days 1 and 2, which had worried her. On day 3, it began to widen. On day 5, it joined a stream she could not step across without wading. On day 7, January 1st, 1972, New Year's Day, she heard what she later identified as the sound of a larger body of water somewhere ahead. She moved faster. The sound resolved into a river. She stood at the confluence for a long moment, breathing. Then she turned downstream and kept walking. The Air Force officially suspended its aerial search for Flight 508 survivors on December 31st, 1971, 7 days after the crash. The ground search teams had located the primary fuselage section on December 29th, recovered 49 bodies, and begun the process of extraction. The total body count stood at 71, confirmed by December 31st, with 20 additional victims still missing in the debris field. The recovery operation was formally reclassified as a retrieval mission rather than a rescue mission. The distinction was administrative. Its effect was absolute. No one was looking for a survivor anymore. On January 3rd, 1972, 11 days after the crash, 3 days after the search was suspended, a group of lumber workers operating a remote camp on a tributary of the Pachatea River heard a noise they initially took for an animal in distress. One of the men walked 40 meters down the riverbank and found a teenage girl standing knee-deep in brown river water, wearing a dress that had once been white, one sandal, and a look on her face that he would describe to Peruvian journalists the following week as the look of someone who had been somewhere that no one should go alone. Her name, she told them when she was able to speak, was Juliane Koepcke. She had been on Flight 508. She had been walking for 11 days. She needed to reach her father. She was alive. She was the only one. The burned boarding pass, seat 19F, Flight 508, December 24th, 1971, had belonged to the only person who walked out of the Amazon jungle that season. It had been filed in a cardboard box in Lima. Nobody had checked it against a survivor report. Nobody had asked whether seat 19F had ever been accounted for. It had taken 22 years for someone to look at the artifact in the box and realize that the name on that boarding pass was not on any casualty list. The question that emerged from that realization was not simply how she survived. The deeper question, the one that the boarding pass forced investigators to confront, was why the search operation had been designed with no mechanism to ask whether any passenger was still alive. Why the protocol had no checkpoint requiring cross-referencing of seat assignments against confirmed body recoveries before suspension of rescue efforts. And whether, if that mechanism had existed, Juliane Koepcke might have been found not on day 11, but on day 3, when the planes passed directly overhead and she waved an orange flag into a 4-foot gap in a 130-foot canopy, and nothing came back down. She had survived because of everything her parents had taught her, and everything she had taught herself, and a single uncontested fact of hydrology. Water runs downhill. But she had also survived 11 days entirely alone because a search operation had closed its eyes on day 7. The boarding pass in the cardboard box was not just a record of a passenger, it was a record of a gap. A systemic gap in a process that had decided, before evidence compelled it to, that there was nothing left to find. What that gap concealed was still not fully understood in 1994, when the boarding pass was first matched to its passenger. The full dimensions of the failure would not become clear until investigators began pulling a second set of records, flight logs, weather reports, a set of internal LANSA communications from the week before the crash, and realized that the story of Flight 508 did not begin at Lima Airport on December 24th. It began at least 14 days earlier, in a maintenance hangar, with a decision that was made, documented, and then deliberately misfiled. The maintenance log they burned before the bodies were cold. The hangar at Jorge Chavez Airport, assigned to LANSA ground operations, was a corrugated metal structure, 180 feet long, built in 1961 and never substantially upgraded. By December 1971, it housed 3 aircraft in various states of disrepair, a parts inventory that a visiting FAA liaison had described 2 years earlier as insufficient for safe operations, and a maintenance log system that consisted of paper forms filed in a green metal cabinet bolted to the wall near the east entrance. The forms were carbon copy documents, 1 copy retained in the cabinet, 1 copy submitted to the Peruvian Dirección General de Aeronáutica Civil at the close of each calendar month. The system worked, in theory, because both copies had to match, if anyone ever compared them. The investigation that began in Lima in January 1973, 18 months after the crash, launched under pressure from the German embassy following sustained requests from Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, found that for LANSA's Electra fleet, the 2 copies had not matched on 23 separate maintenance entries over the preceding 14 months. The discrepancies were not clerical errors. They were structured omissions. Engine inspection results that showed deficiencies on the hangar copy had been rewritten as satisfactory on the DGAC copy before submission. The pattern was consistent enough and specific enough to have required deliberate effort across multiple maintenance cycles. Someone had been correcting the record systematically for over a year before Flight 508 left the ground. The specific aircraft assigned to Flight 508, Electra registration OB-R-941, had last undergone a comprehensive engine inspection on November 8, 1971, 46 days before the crash. The hangar copy of the inspection form, recovered by investigators in January 1973 from the Green Cabinet, noted a discrepancy in the fuel crossfeed valve of engine number 3. Sluggish response under high pressure demand, consistent with partial seal degradation. The recommended action was flagged as schedule for replacement within 15 operating days. And the DGAC copy of the same inspection, the one submitted to the regulatory authority, contained no such notation. The fuel crossfeed valve was listed as inspected and satisfactory. The replacement was never scheduled. The valve was still installed, still degraded on December 24, 1971, when OB-R-941 flew into a lightning storm over the Andes at 10,000 feet with a full fuel load. Whether the valve degradation contributed directly to the fire that followed the lightning strike has never been formally established. What the investigation established was something worse than a single mechanical failure. It established a system in which mechanical failures were being routinely erased before they could be acted upon. Hans Wilhelm Koepcke learned his daughter was alive on January 4th, 1972. He had spent 11 days in a condition that no clinical vocabulary adequately describes. A state of knowing, with near certainty, that his wife was dead, and not knowing with any certainty at all whether his daughter was also dead or simply missing in 4,000 square miles of Amazonian jungle with no radio contact and no search team actively looking for survivors. He had filed a formal request with the Peruvian Air Force on December 28th to expand the search grid east of the primary debris field toward the river drainage system. The request was received, logged, and denied on the grounds that the operational assessment did not support survivor probability in that zone. He filed a second request on December 30th, the day before the aerial search was suspended. It was also denied. He chartered a small private aircraft on January 1st using his own funds, flew a reconnaissance pass over the area he had identified based on his knowledge of the Pachatea drainage system, and saw nothing through the canopy. He was not a trained search and rescue pilot. He was a 54-year-old ornithologist with grief in his chest and a knowledge of rivers that was, ultimately, no more precise than his daughter's. When the lumber workers at the Rio Shabanja camp radioed the nearest population center on January 3rd to report the survivor they had found, the message took approximately 6 hours to reach a Peruvian Air Force communications desk in Pucallpa. It took a further 4 hours for the Air Force to cross-reference the survivor's name against the Flight 508 manifest and confirm she was a passenger. Hans Wilhelm Koepcke was not notified by official channels. He was notified by a journalist from a Lima newspaper who had heard the radio report and reached him by telephone before any government agency had organized a formal notification. His response to the journalist, recorded and published the following morning, was 6 words. I knew she would find the river. He reached his daughter at a lumber camp clinic on January 4th. She had been treated for dehydration, the infected eye wound, the broken collarbone, and the arm laceration, now clean of larvae, but requiring antibiotic treatment that the camp medic had begun with whatever supplies were on hand. She had lost an estimated 35 pounds, She was 17 years old, and she had been completely alone in the Amazon jungle for 11 days. And when her father walked into the clinic room and she saw him, she reportedly said in German, "Papa, I couldn't find Mama." It was the first full sentence she had spoken in 11 days that was not a navigation calculation. Maria Koepcke's body was recovered from the debris field on January 12, 1972. She had survived the initial impact, but had died of her injuries before rescue was possible. She was 45 years old. The crash took her and 90 others and left behind a 17-year-old girl and a burned boarding pass in a box that nobody would open for 22 years. The accident investigation report published by the Peruvian DGAC in August 1973 ran to 312 pages. It identified primary cause of the accident as aircraft structural failure resulting from lightning strike during flight through severe convective weather. It identified contributing factors as crew decision-making in the context of adverse weather advisory information. It contained 14 specific safety recommendations directed at Peruvian aviation authorities, including mandatory weather avoidance protocols, improved maintenance documentation procedures, and a review of LANSA's operating certificate. LANSA's operating certificate was revoked in August 1973, the same month the report was published. The airline ceased operations. Its remaining aircraft were redistributed to other carriers or grounded for parts. The hangar at Jorge Chavez was cleared, cleaned, and reassigned within 6 weeks. The investigation report did not mention the 23 discrepant maintenance entries. It did not mention the fuel crossfeed valve on engine number 3. It referenced maintenance records as reviewed and found consistent with regulatory requirements, a finding that the investigators who discovered the green cabinet in January 1973 later said they could not reconcile with what the cabinet actually contained. In oral testimony given during a Peruvian congressional review in 1975, one of the junior investigators on the original team stated that the maintenance discrepancy findings had been drafted into an early version of the report and had been removed before final publication at the direction of a senior official whose name he declined to provide. The congressional review did not subpoena the official's identity. The testimony was entered into the congressional record and not followed up. The record was not declassified until 1991. The 1991 declassification produced no immediate investigation. Peru in 1991 was managing a different kind of emergency: the Shining Path insurgency, economic collapse, a cholera epidemic. A 20-year-old aviation report with redacted maintenance findings was not a priority for any agency with functioning resources. Declassified testimony sat in the archive. It was not published. It was not reported. It waited. In 1994, a graduate student in aviation history at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, named Diego Archimedes Vega, was writing a thesis on regulatory failures in Peruvian commercial aviation between 1960 and 1980. He was not specifically researching Flight 508. He was researching LANSA's full operational history as a case study. He had obtained the declassified congressional records through a routine archival request and was working through them methodically when he encountered the 1975 testimony about the removal of maintenance findings from the accident report. He pulled the full 312-page DGAC report and compared its maintenance section against the congressional record. The divergence was explicit. The 1973 report said records were consistent with requirements. The 1975 testimony said records contained 23 discrepancies serious enough to have been drafted into the report. One of these documents was lying. Vega spent 3 weeks tracing the chain of custody for the original investigation materials and eventually located the evidence storage box that had been transferred from DGAC to a military archive in Callao in 1974. The box contained, among other items, the original green cabinet maintenance forms, the carbon copies, and a manila folder marked with a hand-stamped designation Vega had not seen before in any aviation archive. Archivo reservado. Acceso restringido. Reserved archive. Restricted access. He was not supposed to have the box. The archival transfer in 1974 had moved the evidence from civilian to military jurisdiction, which meant civilian researchers required a separate clearance to access it. Vega's original request had not specified the military archive. The box had been provided to him in error by a records clerk who had processed his civilian DGAC request without checking the jurisdictional notation on the transfer document. Vega spent 4 hours with the box before the error was identified, and a uniformed officer arrived to collect the materials. In those 4 hours, he photographed approximately 200 pages using a personal camera. One of those images, captured in the final 10 minutes before the officer arrived, showed the personal effects evidence log from the Flight 508 crash site. He noticed it because a line near the bottom of the third page had been annotated in red ink, in handwriting different from the rest of the document, with 2 words. The annotation read, Pasajera Viva, living passenger. The annotation was dated January 4th, 1972, the day Juliane Koepcke reached the lumber camp. Someone had added the note to the personal effects log, presumably to flag that the items belonging to seat 19F should be treated differently from those belonging to deceased passengers. The items from seat 19F, according to the log, included 1 burned boarding pass, 1 wool cardigan, and a small leather coin purse containing 7 soles and a folded note in German. The cardigan and the coin purse were marked as returned to next of kin. The boarding pass was marked as retained for evidence, Category 3, which in the DGAC evidence classification system meant structural or operational relevance. A boarding pass had no structural or operational relevance to a crash investigation. It was a paper document carried by a passenger. It should have been returned to the passenger. Instead, it had been filed under a category that guaranteed it would remain in the evidence archive, inaccessible for as long as the investigation was considered open. The investigation had been classified as closed in August 1973, the month the DGAC report was published. The evidence archive should have been transferred to long-term storage at that point, with personal effects returned to families. The boarding pass was not returned. It remained in a box, in a cabinet, in an archive that shifted jurisdictions twice over the following 2 decades. Juliane Koepcke never received it. She was not notified it existed. Vega published his thesis in 1995. It drew significant attention from aviation safety researchers in Latin America and moderate attention in the German press, which covered it primarily through the lens of Juliane Koepcke's survival story, already well known in Germany, less so in Peru. The maintenance discrepancy findings from his 4 hours with the evidence box formed the core of his thesis argument. He could not reproduce the original documents because the military archive had declined to confirm his access request, and the box had not been returned to civilian jurisdiction. He was working entirely from photographs of 200 pages out of a box that contained what he estimated as 800 or more. The photographs were blurry in places, cut off at the edges in others, and entirely missing sections he hadn't had time to reach. He identified this limitation clearly in his thesis. He identified it as a gap. The gap implied that the full contents of the box were unknown, and that the unknown portion might contain information that either supported or contradicted his findings. He made a formal request to the military archive for access to the complete evidence set in February 1995. The request was denied without explanation. He made a second request in September 1995, attaching copies of the relevant congressional record. The request was denied again, this time with a written notice citing Decree 09-4-8-7-DE, a 1987 Defense Ministry order classifying certain pre-1990 military operational records as sensitive due to connections with anti-insurgency operations during the Shining Path period. Vega's attorney wrote 2 letters arguing that aviation accident evidence from 1972 had no conceivable connection to anti-insurgency operations in the 1980s. The archive's legal office did not respond to either letter. The box remained classified. The maintenance forms remained inaccessible. The thesis was published, discussed, and gradually filed away in the same quiet way that inconvenient academic work tends to be filed, cited in footnotes, not read in full, not acted upon by any institution with the authority to act. Juliane Koepcke, by this point, was Dr. Juliane Diller. She had earned a doctorate in biology, worked at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology in Munich, and continued the field work at the Panguana Research Station that her parents had founded. She had given interviews about her survival experience. She had published a memoir. She had never been formally notified by the Peruvian government of the existence of the maintenance discrepancy findings. She had never been notified that the boarding pass from seat 19F was sitting in a restricted military archive in Callao. She had never been told that someone had written Pasajera Viva in red ink next to her name on an evidence log, and that the document had then been sealed under a defense decree that had nothing to do with her. She found out because Vega sent her a copy of his thesis in 1995 with a handwritten note attached to the chapter on personal effects. I believe you have never received what belongs to you. What followed was not a formal legal proceeding. It was not a government investigation. It was something slower and less spectacular and considerably more persistent. A correspondence. Vega and Diller exchanged letters. Physical letters because email was not yet standard practice in German academic institutions in 1995. Over the following 18 months, reconstructing from available sources the chain of custody that had led a burned boarding pass from a crash site to a restricted military archive to a cardboard box that had never been audited. The correspondence produced a document, a 34-page chronological reconstruction of every known decision point at which the evidence from Flight 508 had been moved, reclassified, or withheld. Vega called it, in the covering note he sent with the final version, a map. Not a map of the jungle, a map of the silence. The map had 7 identified gaps, points at which the documentary record stopped and resumed without explanation. 3 of those gaps corresponded to known dates of internal LANSA communications that had been referenced in the congressional testimony but never entered into evidence. The congressional investigator who had drafted the maintenance findings section of the original 1973 report had mentioned in his 1975 testimony that his findings were based not only on the physical forms in the green cabinet, but also on a series of internal LANSA memoranda, communications between the maintenance director and the airline's operations management. Those memoranda had been submitted to the investigation team as part of the document request to LANSA's receivers. They had appeared on the evidence intake log. They had not appeared in the evidence archive that Vega photographed in 1994. They were not in the box. 7 internal memoranda covering a period between October 15th and December 20th, 1971, the 4 days before the crash, had been logged into the investigation and had subsequently vanished. In the last letter Vega sent Diller before the correspondence was interrupted by a change in her institutional address, he wrote, "The missing memoranda are not the mystery. The mystery is that they were logged. Someone recorded their existence, which means someone had to make a decision to remove them afterward. That decision has a name attached to it. The name is in the intake log. I have seen the intake log. I did not photograph that page." He hadn't photographed it because the officer arrived before he reached it. The intake log was still in the box. The box was still in the archive. And the name of the person who had signed for the submission of 7 memoranda that no longer existed was written in ink on a page that no civilian had been permitted to see since 1974. In 1997, Diego Vega filed a 3rd access request, this time through a different mechanism, a formal petition under Peru's new transparency legislation, passed in 1996 under international pressure, which required government agencies to respond to public information requests within 30 days. The Archives Legal Office had 30 days. On day 29, they responded. The response was 4 sentences. The first 3 outlined the applicable regulatory framework. The 4th sentence read, "The materials requested are not available for public access at this time due to ongoing administrative review." Ongoing administrative review of a 1972 aviation accident, 25 years after the crash. The response was signed by an administrator. The administrator's signature was followed, as was standard on official correspondence, by the administrator's full name, title, and institutional identification number. Vega filed the response in a folder. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to a journalist, not to a government office. He called a retired DGAC inspector who had worked on the original 1973 investigation and had, in 1975, given the congressional testimony that started all of this. The inspector was 71 years old. He was living in Arequipa. When Vega read him the name on the response letter, the line was silent for several seconds. Then the inspector said, "That's impossible. That man died in 1981. The name on the letter, the man in the ground, the truth that walked out anyway. A dead man does not sign administrative correspondence." This is not a philosophical observation. It is a procedural one. Every response letter issued by a Peruvian government agency in 1997 under the new transparency legislation required an institutional identification number, a 9-digit alphanumeric code assigned to individual civil servants upon appointment, retired upon separation, and permanently closed upon confirmed death. The code could not be reused, it could not be transferred, it existed in one record attached to one name for one career, and then it stopped. The code on the response letter that Diego Vega received on the 29th day of his 30-day transparency request window belonged to a DGAC administrative official named Rodrigo Esteban Farfan Lorca, who had served as head of records management at the Civil Aviation Authority between 1969 and 1978, had retired in 1979, and had died at a hospital in Miraflores, Lima, on March 7, 1981. His death had been registered, his pension had been closed, and his institutional identification code had been marked as inactive in the Civil Service Personnel Database maintained by the Ministerio de Trabajo. It had been marked inactive in 1981. It had been used to sign a letter in 1997. 16 years after the man was in the ground, his credentials had issued a denial. The retired DGAC inspector in Arequipa, whose name was Cesar Montoya Quispe, was 71 years old and had spent 22 years doing his best to forget everything he knew about the Flight 508 investigation. When Vega read him the name on the letter, his silence lasted 4 seconds. Then he said it was impossible. Then he asked Vega to read the identification number. Vega read it. Montoya asked him to read it again. Vega read it again. Montoya said, "That number was Farfan's number. I processed his separation paperwork myself. He was dead before the military archive got the box." He paused. "Somebody is using a dead man's credentials to respond to public information requests." Another pause. "They have been doing this long enough to know exactly which number to use." This was not a clerical error. A clerical error produces an incorrect number. An incorrect number would fail the system's verification cross-reference and generate a returned letter within 48 hours. This letter had passed verification. It had been processed. It had been mailed. For it to pass verification, the number had to be active in the current civil service database, which meant someone had, at some point, restored the designation of a dead man to active status. Restoring an inactive code required administrator-level access to the personnel database. It required deliberate action. It required knowing which dead man to use and why that specific man's credentials would be useful. Farfan had been head of records management at the DGAC from 1969 to 1978. He had been, in other words, the person responsible for evidence intake during the 1973 Flight 508 investigation. He had signed the intake log. His name was the name on the page that Vega had not photographed. Vega drove from Lima to Arequipa to meet Montoya in person. The drive took 18 hours. He arrived on a Thursday morning in October 1997 with a photocopy of the transparency denial letter and a manila folder containing every document he had accumulated since 1994. The thesis photographs, the congressional testimony, the chronological reconstruction he had built with Juliane Diller, the correspondence with the archive. He spread everything on Montoya's kitchen table, and they worked through it for 13 hours. Montoya's wife brought them food twice and tea 3 times and otherwise left them alone. By 10 p.m., they had identified 4 things that the available record could establish. First, 7 memoranda had been logged into the 1973 investigation and had subsequently disappeared from the archive box. Second, the intake log showing who submitted those memoranda bore the signature of Farfan, who had since died. Third, someone had reactivated Farfan's credential code and used it to deflect a legitimate transparency request. Fourth, the credential reactivation required administrator-level access to a government database, access that, by definition, existed within a government agency that was still operational in 1997. What the record could not establish was the most important thing: the content of the 7 missing memoranda. Without those documents, the maintenance discrepancy findings remained the work of a graduate student whose supporting evidence was locked in a box he wasn't supposed to have opened. Without those documents, the gap between negligence and deliberate decisions was not closable. The memoranda covered the period between October 15th and December 20th, 1971. The crash occurred on December 24th. The final 4 days of that window, December 17th through December 20th, were the 4 days on which the Peruvian Weather Service had first issued extended range forecasts for the storm system that would reach the Andes corridor on Christmas Eve. If the memoranda existed and pertained to operational decision-making in that window, they would speak directly to what LANSA's management knew, and when they knew it, and what they chose to do. Vega asked Montoya whether he had any recollection of the memoranda from the original investigation. Montoya looked at his tea for a long time. Then he said he remembered that they existed, that he had read them, and that they had been the reason the maintenance findings section of the report was initially drafted with language stronger than what appeared in the final version. He remembered that the language in the draft had characterized the pattern of maintenance discrepancy as systematic falsification of regulatory submissions, rather than the final report's phrase of inconsistencies in documentation procedures. He remembered that the word falsification had been removed before publication. He did not remember by whose instruction. He said he had 22 years of trying not to remember that part. He said he thought if he'd remembered it, he would have had to do something about it, and he hadn't known what that would be, and by the time he retired in 1978, it had seemed too late to do anything anyway. I was not a brave man, he told Vega. I was an inspector. I inspected. I wrote what I was allowed to write. This is how people like me participate in things like this. LANSA had been in financial trouble for most of its operational existence. The airline had been founded in 1963 with capital from a group of Peruvian investors that included 2 former military officers and a construction company with government contracts. By 1970, after the first 2 major crashes, insurance rates had increased to the point where the airline's operating margins were functionally negative on most routes. The Christmas holiday season represented for a Peruvian regional carrier in 1971 approximately 22% of annual revenue compressed into 18 days. The Lima to Pucallpa run on December 24th carried 86 passengers, a full cabin. At the fare rates in effect in December 1971, that single flight generated revenue equivalent to 11 days of normal operations on the same route. Canceling it was not, from a financial standpoint, a neutral decision. canceling it was, in the context of LANSA's debt position that December, an existential one. The man responsible for the operational decision to clear Flight 508 for departure on December 24, 1971, was LANSA's Director of Operations, a position held at that time by a man named Ernesto Guevara Baldeón. He was 44 years old in December 1971. He had spent 12 years in Peruvian commercial aviation, first as a ground operations supervisor, then in cargo scheduling, then in his senior role at LANSA. He was not a pilot. He was a logistics man, someone who thought in terms of load factors and revenue per flight hour and the relationship between cancellation rates and government subsidy applications. He was also, according to a 1975 congressional deposition that Vega had found in the declassified archive, the man who had received the weather advisory for the Huánuco corridor on the morning of December 24th and had signed a clearance form authorizing Flight 508 to proceed at 10:37 a.m., 23 minutes before departure. The 1975 deposition had been given by a LANSA operations clerk named Patricia Solano Reyes, who had worked under Guevara Baldeón and had been present when the weather advisory was received. She stated that she had placed the advisory on his desk, that he had read it, and that he had signed the clearance form without discussion. She stated further that this was not unusual, that weight versus revenue calculations in bad weather departure decisions were standard operational practice at LANSA, and that she had witnessed similar decisions on at least 6 prior occasions when weather advisories had been received and clearances had been signed anyway. She stated that she had never been asked to formally document these decisions, that the clearance forms did not require notation of weather conditions, and that the advisory itself was kept in a separate filing system from the operational record, making it structurally invisible to any subsequent review of the departure authorization chain. Guevara Baldeón was not present to respond to Solano Reyes' deposition. He had left Peru in June 1974, 9 months after LANSA's operating certificate was revoked. Peruvian records indicated he had emigrated to Argentina. No extradition request was filed because no criminal charges were filed in Peru. The 1973 DGAC report had not characterized the departure decision as criminal. It had characterized it as a contributing factor to an accident with a primary cause of structural failure due to lightning. Criminal liability requires deliberate or reckless endangerment to be formally established. The formal establishment of recklessness requires documentation of what decision makers knew. The documentation of what decision makers knew, the 7 memoranda, had been submitted to the investigation and had subsequently ceased to exist. Guevara Baldeón died in Buenos Aires on February 14th, 1992. He was 65 years old. He had never been extradited, never charged, never formally questioned by any legal authority about December 24th, 1971. He died in a private clinic. His obituary, published in a Buenos Aires newspaper, identified him as a retired aviation executive from Peru. It did not mention LANSA. It did not mention Flight 508. It did not mention 92 people aboard a Lockheed Electra in a storm over the Andes on Christmas Eve. The question of who had reactivated Farfán's credential code in 1997, 16 years after Farfán's death, was answered not by an investigation but by an accident. In March 1999, a Peruvian investigative journalist named Ana Cecilia Juliane Vargas, working for the Lima weekly Carretas, published a two-part article based on Vega's 1995 thesis and the subsequent correspondence with Juliane Diller. The article's second installment included a reproduction of the 1997 Transparency Denial Letter, with the institutional identification number visible. A retired civil service database administrator who read the article contacted Juliane Vargas. He told her the number had been reactivated in 1989, 8 years after Farfan's death, under a database migration process that had incorrectly converted inactive codes to pending status if they lacked a confirmed death certificate filed directly with the civil service rather than with the health registry. Farfan's death had been registered with the health registry, but not directly with the civil service personnel office. The gap in administrative communication had produced an error. The error had left his code technically active. Whoever signed the 1997 response letter had either discovered this active status and chosen to exploit it, or had not known Farfan was dead and had simply used the name of the records official who had handled the original intake 2 decades earlier. Both possibilities were disturbing. One implied calculated fraud. The other implied that the archive's administrative system was so disconnected from living institutional memory that no one had checked in 24 years whether the official they were attributing correspondence to was still alive. In either case, the effect, a legitimate transparency request denied under a dead man's signature, was the same. The mechanism was different. The outcome was indistinguishable from deliberate suppression, regardless of whether it was deliberate. Juliane Vargas's articles generated enough public attention that the Peruvian Congreso formed a review committee in June 1999. The committee requested that the military archive in Callao transfer the Flight 508 evidence box to civilian jurisdiction for independent review. The archive's legal office filed an objection, citing Decree 094-8-7-DE. The committee's legal counsel filed a response arguing that the decree's applicability to 1972 aviation accident materials was not legitimate. The back and forth consumed 14 months. In August 2000, 29 years after the crash, the archive transferred the box. The transfer document noted that one item originally logged in the intake record could not be located within the box. A manila folder labeled Correspondencia Interna, LANSA, Octubre to Diciembre, 1971. Internal correspondence. 7 entries in the intake log. 0 documents in the folder. The memoranda were gone. They had been in the box when it entered military jurisdiction in 1974. They were not in the box when it left in 2000. No transfer log, no destruction order, no administrative removal record existed to account for their absence. They had, in the language of the committee's final report, been removed from the evidence set at an unknown date by an unknown party for unknown purposes. The committee recommended a criminal inquiry into the removal. The criminal inquiry was formally opened in November 2000. It was transferred to a backlogged court docket in February 2001. It remained on that docket for 11 years without proceeding to hearing. It was formally closed in 2012 under a statute of limitations applying to documentary fraud. The remaining items in the box were processed. Most were returned to next of kin families who could be located. Some had no surviving family to contact. Some items were transferred to the Museo de la Nación in Lima as historical materials. One item, a burned boarding pass, seat 19F, catalogued under the evidence designation Objeto Personal Pasajera Viva, was identified as belonging to a living person. A form letter was prepared by the committee's administrative office and mailed to an address in Munich, Germany. Dr. Juliane Diller received the letter in September 2000. She was 46 years old. The letter informed her that a personal effect belonging to her, recovered from the wreckage of LANSA Flight 508 on or about January 7, 1972, had been held in administrative evidence storage and was now available for return to her. If she wished to receive the item, she should complete the enclosed form and return it within 60 days. The enclosed form asked for her identification, her mailing address, and a declaration confirming that she was the person named on the original passenger manifest. She completed the form. She returned it. She waited. The boarding pass arrived in Munich in a padded envelope on March 4, 2001. Inside the envelope was a slip of paper confirming the item's evidence number, original recovery date, and chain of custody log. The boarding pass itself was inside a clear archival sleeve. Juliane held it and looked at it for some time. The burned edge, the LANSA logo mostly gone. The seat number 19F, still legible on the surviving strip. She had been 17 years old when she held this boarding pass the last time, standing in a line at Jorge Chavez Airport on Christmas Eve morning wearing a white dress, traveling with her mother to spend the holiday with her father. She was 46 years old now. Her mother had been dead for 29 years. She had spent 11 days in the Amazon and 29 years in the space between what had happened and what had been acknowledged. In 2011, she donated the boarding pass to the Deutsches Museum in Munich, which acquired it for its aviation history collection. The accession record describes it as burned boarding pass, LANSA Flight 508, December 24, 1971. Sole survivor documentation. It is displayed in a small frame next to a photograph taken at the lumber camp on January 4, 1972. A 17-year-old girl with a swollen eye and a broken collarbone and bare feet on a wooden floor, looking at something outside the frame that the photographer did not capture. The final count for LANSA's operational history between 1963 and 1973 is not complicated. 3 major crashes, 246 dead, 1 survivor. The airline flew for 10 years, lost 3 aircraft to catastrophic accidents, was suspended twice and reinstated twice, and in that time carried tens of thousands of passengers on routes where internal maintenance records showed ongoing safety deficiencies that were never translated to regulatory submissions. The gap between what the Green Cabinet showed and what the DGAC received was not the result of an understaffed filing department. It was the result of a decision, repeated, sustained, and deliberate, to present a safer airline to the regulatory authority than the one that actually existed. That decision was made by people who understood the consequences of exposure and who had within the system they operated in sufficient institutional access to manage those consequences across 2 decades and 1 change of government. On December 24th, 1971, at approximately 10 a.m., a 17-year-old girl stood in a departure line at Lima Airport with a boarding pass in her hand and no knowledge that the aircraft she was about to board had a degraded fuel crossfeed valve on engine number 3, that the maintenance record showing this deficiency had been altered before regulatory submission, that the operations director who would clear her flight for departure had already read a weather advisory he would not act on, and that none of this information was available to her or to any of the other 91 people boarding that plane. She had no way to know. The information had been managed away from her, deliberately and repeatedly, by a system built to protect revenue over lives. What she had instead, what she carried onto that plane and into the jungle, and for 11 days through the Amazon, and for 29 years after that, was the knowledge of rivers. The knowledge that water runs downhill. The knowledge that if you follow a creek long enough, something human will appear. Her father had taught her this in a scientific context: drainage patterns, hydrology, ecological mapping. He had not taught it to her as a survival skill, because he had not imagined she would ever need it as one. He had taught it to her as the language of a landscape she lived in. It became, in 11 days, the only language she had. She emerged from the jungle because she knew where the water went. She emerged into a world that did not know the full dimensions of what had put her there. A world where the maintenance forms were in a box and the memoranda were already missing, and the investigation was already being shaped toward an outcome that would cost no one with power anything at all. She cooperated with every inquiry that asked for her testimony. She gave interviews. She published a memoir. She waited for the institutions that were supposed to function. When the boarding pass arrived in a padded envelope in Munich in 2001, she did not call a press conference. She did not issue a statement. She held it for a while, and then she put it somewhere safe. And then 10 years later, she gave it to a museum where someone had decided it belonged. The men who altered the maintenance forms are dead. The man who cleared Flight 508 for departure died in Buenos Aires in 1992, unquestioned. The 7 memoranda do not exist in any accessible archive. The criminal inquiry into their removal was closed in 2012 under a statute of limitations. The administrative code of a dead man was used to deny a transparency request in 1997, and the explanation for that usage, whether it was fraud or error, was never fully established to anyone's legal satisfaction. None of the structural mechanisms that allowed LANSA to systematically misrepresent its safety record to regulators across 10 years were the subject of prosecutorial action. The regulatory authority that accepted falsified maintenance submissions without audit was reformed eventually as part of broader aviation safety improvements implemented across Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s. The reforms were real. The accountability for the specific history that required them was not. What remains is a burned boarding pass in a frame in a German museum. A photograph of a girl who looks older than 17. A thesis by a graduate student who spent 4 hours with a box he wasn't supposed to open. A creek in the Peruvian Amazon that still runs downhill, through the same canopy, toward the same river, exactly as it did in January 1972, when a 17-year-old girl followed it out of a jungle that 91 other people never left. She did not survive because she was exceptional. She survived because she paid attention, because her parents had raised her in a place where attention was required, and she had learned to give it. The jungle did not save her. The river did not save her. She saved herself one step at a time across 11 days and approximately 40 kilometers through terrain that was trying, in its completely indifferent way, to kill her. The boarding pass was the object that started this story. It was proof of passage, evidence that a person had been in a place, had been assigned a seat, had been cleared to travel. It did not prove anything about what happened to her after she boarded. It did not prove she survived. The survival was something she accomplished herself, in the dark, wet, painful absence of anyone who knew where she was. The boarding pass was just a piece of paper. It was the paper that started the question. She was the answer. She is still alive. She is 70 years old. She still works at Panguana, the research station her parents founded in 1968. The birds still call in the forest outside the station at dusk. She can still name them all.